3 days before Christmas, while the city outside shimmered with lights and quiet carols filtered through the frozen air, my world shifted in a single phone call. I had just walked through the door of my tiny apartment in Nashville, kicking off my hospital clogs and shrugging out of my heavy winter coat, a tired but genuine smile tugging at my lips. In the corner of the room sat my carefully packed suitcase, a small forest green sweater draped neatly over it, and several wrapped presents stacked, like promises by the door. I had bought gifts for everyone, even remembered the ingredients for the apple cinnamon bread, pudding my family loved, but never seemed to remember who made. I had tried so hard to do everything right to be enough. When my phone buzzed and I saw Ethan's name flash on the screen, I thought nothing of it. Maybe he needed me to bring extra napkins or maybe coordinate rides, like every other year. I picked up, the warmth still in my voice. "Hey, Ethan." But his voice was different this time, lighter, almost rehearsed. "Hey, Nat. So listen, Celeste is coming to Christmas this year. She's really sensitive to, energies and stuff. With your work, the hospital, and everything can feel kind of heavy. I think, for her sake, it might be better if you sat this one out. It's nothing personal." I stood there, staring at the lights blinking lazily on my small Christmas tree. Nothing personal. My hands tightened around the phone, but I kept my voice even. "Okay," I said, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. An hour later, my mother called. Her voice was soft, the way it always got when she wanted something unpleasant to sound gentle, like wrapping barbed wire in silk. "Honey, we're just trying to make things easy for everyone. You know how Celeste is. If you come, it might cause confusion. Honestly, if you show up, we might not even answer the door." That was it. No pretense left. No invitation withheld with regret. No, this was an eviction, wrapped in pleasantries. I wasn't just not wanted. I was unwelcome. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't plead for a spot at the table where I had never truly belonged. I simply hung up, set the phone down carefully on the counter, and stared at the small, hopeful pile of wrapped gifts by the door. Gifts that would never be opened by the people I had spent my life trying to love enough to be seen. I moved slowly, deliberately, like someone packing up after an invisible funeral. I logged into my banking app. Mortgage top-up canceled. Emergency maintenance fund locked. Car loan assistance terminated. I wasn't angry. I was simply done. For years, I had convinced myself that love meant sacrifice, that being the dependable one was enough to earn a seat at the family table. But standing there in the quiet, with the hum of the radiator and the smell of cinnamon lingering from the bread, pudding I had baked that morning, I realized the truth. I was never really invited to belong. I was just tolerated until my presence became inconvenient. The first snow began to fall outside, soft and relentless, blanketing the street in silence. I watched it through the window, feeling an unexpected stillness settle inside me. No more trying. No more shrinking myself down to fit into the cramped spaces they offered. No more pretending. This Christmas, I would not be the one standing outside the door, heart in hand, begging to be let in, and for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't have to be. Growing up, I used to think it was normal, the way some children shone brighter under the same roof while others simply kept the lights on. I was born first, the trial run, as my father once joked at a barbecue while handing Ethan the bigger slice of cake. The golden boy, the miracle baby, creative, charming, the one they had prayed for during endless nights of silent disappointment. And me, I was just first. I remember the day Ethan took a black permanent marker to the living room walls, his wild loops and swirls covering the beige paint like rebellious vines. My parents called it expressive, their laughter warm and indulgent. When I dropped a bowl while setting the table 2 days later, I was careless, too distracted, too serious. I remember their faces then, the way they looked at me like I was an obligation wrapped in skin, an expectation I could never quite meet. At school, I earned straight A's without missing a beat. The report cards were slid into drawers without a word, while Ethan's participation ribbon hung proudly on the fridge for weeks. Once, I wrote a letter to my guidance counselor asking for help applying to medical school. I left it on the kitchen counter, perfectly placed, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to ask why I needed it. No one ever did. When I got my acceptance into the University of North Carolina School of Medicine, first round, no wait list, I came home holding the letter like a trophy. My mother skimmed it, smiled faintly, and said, "That's intense, honey. You'll have to be careful not to burn out." Then she turned back to the stove, stirring something that would never quite taste like approval. And Ethan, when he dropped out of college for the third time, chasing the dream of creative direction, they threw him a re-entry party. Balloons, cake, a framed photo of him holding a paintbrush still hangs in the hallway like a shrine. The house, which had never celebrated my milestones, practically vibrated with pride for the son who hadn't yet found his footing. I once found one of my old sketchbooks, doodles from long shifts, fragments of stories and sunsets, tossed into the recycling bin under a pile of grocery store flyers. When I asked about it, they laughed and said they thought it was scrap paper. Maybe it was to them, maybe I was too. Still, I kept going. Through med school, through residency, through long nights of sitting beside patients no one else wanted to sit with. I chose geriatrics because I saw something in those abandoned hallways, a mirror, maybe a silent kinship with people who had given their lives to others and been forgotten when they stopped being convenient. At home, my role remained unchanged. Quiet, reliable, invisible. I paid for the leaky roof when the insurance wouldn't cover it. I slipped extra cash into Ethan's accounts when his freelance gigs dried up. I covered copays for my mother's physical therapy. I sent money when Dad's truck needed new brakes. I did it because I loved them, or maybe because I still believed love was something you earned, something you bought with enough sacrifice. They never asked for public thanks. They didn't need to. Gratitude, in their language, wasn't spoken aloud. It was assumed like air, like obligation. And so, every time I handed over another piece of myself, they took it with open hands and closed hearts, never once thinking to look back. I told myself that was what family meant. Unseen but necessary. The scaffolding holding up everyone else's dreams. It wasn't until the phone calls that night, their voices so casual, so polite in their cruelty, that I realized scaffolding isn't supposed to bleed for the building it supports. Adulthood didn't change the pattern, it just made it more expensive. I moved into my first apartment after residency, a one-bedroom with peeling paint and a faulty heater, while Ethan lived downtown in a loft that my parents helped subsidize because he needed inspiration. When their roof caved in after a spring storm, I was the one who quietly wired the money to the contractor. When their medical bills piled up after Dad's surgery, I negotiated payment plans and sent checks they never even acknowledged. No one asked me to. No one had to. It was easier that way, being useful without being seen. I told myself that my purpose was to catch the pieces that would otherwise shatter, that my value wasn't in being celebrated, but in being essential. Every emergency had my name written in invisible ink across it. Ethan's dead car battery at midnight? I paid for a new one before the morning frost thawed. My mother's overdue physical therapy? I called the clinic myself, settled the bills, and arranged transportation. When Ethan impulsively bought new camera equipment and couldn't afford his Thanksgiving flight home, I covered the ticket again. He hugged me at the airport, called me the best sister ever, and by the next week the favor was forgotten, folded into the endless ledger of expectations. They never had to ask. I stayed ahead of their needs like a ghost in the machinery of their lives, fixing, smoothing, covering, while carefully erasing my own fingerprints. Gratitude would have made it harder to keep using me. So it was better, maybe, that they forgot. I was the scaffolding again, the hidden beam in the house they never thought to thank because it had never collapsed until now. Sometimes late at night, after double shifts at the hospital, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea and wonder what it would feel like to be seen. Not as a utility, not as a fallback plan, but simply as Natalie, someone whose presence was enough without having to earn her keep every holiday, every family dinner, every whispered crisis. But the years taught me not to linger too long on wishes. Wishes were for children and golden boys. Wishes didn't pay mortgages or reset expectations carved in bone. So I kept moving, kept showing up, kept absorbing every slight and every omission like a sponge that was never supposed to leak. When Christmas rolled around each year, I baked the apple cinnamon bread pudding they all loved, carefully wrapping it in foil and smiling when they said, "Oh, this is just like the one from last year," as if it had appeared by magic. When Ethan struggled with rent between gigs, I wired a quiet deposit into his account and ignored the way he only called afterward to brag about a new project. When my parents needed help filing their taxes, I stayed up until 2 in the morning on the phone, walking them through deductions they barely understood, while my own returns sat untouched on the counter. I thought that love meant being the one who stayed late, who answered every call, who solved every problem before it could become an inconvenience. I thought that if I just did enough, sacrificed enough, eventually the equation would balance. Eventually someone would look at me and see more than a safety net stretched too thin. But that night, standing in my small kitchen with the phone still warm in my hand, I realized the terrible truth. No matter how much I gave, they would never see me, because they had never learned how, and I had never made them. That night, after the phone calls ended and the false pleasantries dissolved into silence, I sat alone in my dimly lit apartment, the scent of cinnamon still clinging to the air like a memory that refused to leave. Outside, the snow thickened, soft and indifferent, blanketing the city in a quiet that felt almost reverent. I watched it fall through the frosted window, the lights from the street lamps blurring into halos. I reached for my phone again, but not to call them, not to beg or to reason or to fight. I opened my banking app, the familiar blue and white screen, flickering to life with a quiet beep. Mortgage top-up canceled. $800 a month that had quietly kept their house from slipping into default gone. Emergency maintenance fund locked. No more rainy day rescues. Car loan assistance terminated. Ethan's new battery would be his own problem next winter. It felt mechanical at first, clicking buttons, toggling off automatic payments that had long been woven into my routine, like brushing my teeth or paying my own rent. But with each cancellation, each deliberate act of removal, a strange lightness unfurled inside me, like a bird stretching its wings for the first time in a cage left accidentally open. I pulled out a notebook and made a list, the quiet debts I had absorbed without protest over the years, the plane tickets, the medical bills, the late-night wire transfers, the whispered emergencies, solved without ceremony. I stared at the list until the ink blurred, not from tears but from a grief so old and so deep it had hardened into something almost clean. I wasn't angry, not in the way they would later accuse me of being. I was simply awake for the first time. They would not notice right away. That's the thing about being the invisible scaffolding. It's only when you're gone that anyone realizes you were holding up the whole damn ceiling. The missed mortgage payment wouldn't sting until the final notice arrived. The forgotten rainy day fund wouldn't matter until the pipes burst again in January. Ethan's gigs would still flutter and fall like they always did. But this time there would be no soft landing stitched together by my hands. I didn't announce it. No grand declarations. No fiery text messages. No social media posts dripping with vague sadness. I didn't even tell Aunt Lillian, the only member of the family who still sent me birthday cards with handwritten notes. I simply withdrew, quietly, completely. I deleted the half-written holiday message I had drafted earlier that day, the one wishing everyone a warm and joyful Christmas. I unplugged the tree. I put the wrapped gifts back into the closet, their cheerful paper suddenly garish and strange against the starkness of my new resolve. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel the need to. There was no room for sorrow in the space that had opened inside me, only clarity. Love, I realized, shouldn't feel like a constant performance for an audience that never bothers to applaud. Family shouldn't be a ledger where the cost of belonging is measured in sacrifice after sacrifice until there's nothing left to give. I had spent years believing that if I just gave enough, stayed small enough, smiled wide enough, I could earn a place that should have been mine without question. But love that demands your silence isn't love at all. And family that only welcomes your usefulness isn't family, it's a transaction. One I was no longer willing to pay into. The snow outside thickened, covering the world in a fresh, indifferent hush. Somewhere across town, my family laughed and planned a Christmas I was not invited to. A Christmas they believed would be lighter without me. I let them have it. I let them build their celebration on the illusion they had so carefully constructed, the one where I was the problem, the heavy one, the inconvenient reminder that not everything pretty is pure. For the first time in my life, I chose not to show up, and in doing so, I reclaimed something I hadn't even realized I had lost. Myself. Christmas morning came soft and gray, the world outside blanketed in a heavy silence that seemed to seep into my bones. I sat by the window with a mug of tea cradled in my hands, the faint scent of apple and cinnamon rising from the steam, bittersweet and strangely hollow. The gifts I had so carefully wrapped sat untouched in the corner, bright paper and careful bows mocking me with their misplaced hope. I didn't light the tree. I didn't turn on the holiday playlist that usually played low in the background. I didn't call anyone. I simply sat there, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of rosemary and fabric softener, staring out at a world that for once reflected exactly how I felt inside, quiet, cold, and achingly still. And yet there was no grief clawing at me, no sobs waiting just beneath the surface. There was only a strange, almost sacred stillness, the kind that follows a storm so complete it leaves the air scrubbed clean. I hadn't realized how much noise I had been carrying until it was gone. The day slipped by in slow motion. Noon came and went without the usual flurry of calls and chaotic background noise from my parents' living room. No group photos. No Ethan posting festive selfies with Celeste, the new darling of the family narrative. No last-minute texts asking me to Venmo money because the ham was more expensive than they thought. Just silence. It wasn't until the sun dipped low behind the hills, staining the sky a deep violet, that my phone buzzed. Once, then twice, then 3 times in rapid succession. I ignored it at first, assuming it was some group thread I had forgotten to mute. But then a message popped up. Aunt Lillian, can you answer? You've done enough damage already. My stomach dropped, the words burning into my retinas like an accusation carved in flame. Damage? What damage? I hadn't even been there. Before I could fully process it, my phone rang again. Aunt Lillian's name flashed across the screen. I answered, my voice hoarse from disuse. What happened? I asked. Her voice was soft, careful, like someone approaching a wounded animal. They're saying you ruined Christmas, she said. But you weren't even there. I blinked, stunned into silence. How could I have ruined something I hadn't even been invited to? How could absence be more disruptive than presence? Aunt Lillian hesitated, then continued, piecing the story together in slow, broken phrases. Apparently, some time after dinner, Celeste had wandered through the house, glass of wine in hand, admiring old family photos lined up on the mantel. She had paused at one, a faded snapshot of me from a birthday party long ago, smiling awkwardly in a too-big sweater, and she had recognized me. That's Dr. Natalie Hartman, she had said aloud, her voice carrying over the low hum of post-dinner chatter. She saved my grandmother's life. According to Aunt Lillian, the room fell silent in an instant, forks frozen halfway to mouths, laughter dying mid-breath. What happened next was a blur, mumbled half-truths, awkward glances, a tension thick enough to choke on. Celeste asked if I was the sister they always talked about, and whatever she heard in response made her quietly gather her things, thank my parents stiffly, and leave without another word. By the time Aunt Lillian called me, the fallout had already begun. Celeste had posted something online something honest, something raw. And it had started to ripple through the delicate web of connections my family had spent years weaving around Ethan's budding art career. I didn't know all the details yet. I didn't need to. I could picture it perfectly. The whispered jokes about me being too intense, the casual cruelty disguised as concern, the way they reduced my entire existence to a cautionary tale about ambition and loneliness. It wasn't new, but for once, someone else had been paying attention. Someone who hadn't been raised to believe that kind of cruelty was just the way families loved. Someone who had seen me, really seen me, not through the distorted lens of resentment and guilt, but through the clear memory of a moment when kindness had mattered more than image. That night, as I sat in the deepening quiet, I realized something, maybe the most powerful thing I had ever learned. Sometimes the most profound revenge isn't slamming doors or shouting truths no one wants to hear. Sometimes it's simply stepping away and letting the truth echo in the silence you leave behind. The day after Christmas, the desperation started leaking through the cracks. It began with an email subject line, "Let's reset things," as if years of erasure and dismissal could be wiped clean with a clever title. It was signed not just by my mother or father individually, but by both of them, and Ethan too, as if presenting a united front would somehow erase the fracture they had spent decades carving. I opened it with the clinical detachment I reserved for the worst patient notes, the ones you knew were a disaster before you even read them. They didn't apologize, not really. There were words about heightened emotions, about misunderstandings, about how much they valued family in that careful, polished language that says everything and means nothing. Buried halfway down the fourth paragraph was the real reason for the sudden olive branch. They wanted me to reach out to Celeste, to clarify things, to smooth it over, to protect Ethan's reputation in the art circles she was connected to in New York. It wasn't about me. It was never about me. It was about the fallout, the mess I hadn't even made, the mirrors cracking under the weight of their own reflection. They hadn't suddenly realized they had mistreated me. They had simply realized the cost of that mistreatment had risen higher than they were willing to pay. I didn't reply. That night, my phone buzzed again. This time a call from the hospital administrator, someone I had met only once at a charity gala, a man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He apologized awkwardly, said my father had contacted him, expressed concerns about my emotional stability, implied that perhaps I was struggling and maybe needed some time off. I felt my face flush with cold rage, the kind that doesn't explode but crystallizes, sharp and cutting. My father, the man who once joked that I was too serious for my own good, was now weaponizing that seriousness against me, not because he believed it, but because he thought it would scare me into compliance. Thankfully, the administrator saw through it, but the damage was clear. They weren't trying to mend anything. They were trying to discredit me, to control me the only way they knew how, by making me small again. When that failed, the next wave came in the form of group texts to extended family, carefully curated half-truths painting me as volatile, isolated, struggling with some things right now. No mention of being uninvited from Christmas. No mention of the years of silent sacrifice. Just a quiet campaign of whispers, designed to erode trust before I could even open my mouth. A cousin I hadn't heard from in 5 years messaged me offering a voucher for a yoga retreat, just in case you're feeling overwhelmed. She wrote with a smiling emoji at the end. Overwhelmed wasn't the word, awake was. Each attempt at manipulation, each small betrayal dressed in the language of concern, only clarified what I had already begun to understand. They weren't fighting for me. They were fighting for the image of themselves they had built in their own minds, the family where Ethan was brilliant and beloved, where I was the dutiful, quiet sister who never made waves, where appearances were preserved at all costs. But I was done preserving them. I watched the snow continue to fall outside my window, each flake erasing another trace of the road behind me. And for the first time I felt no urge to explain, no desperate need to defend my side of the story. I knew the truth, and maybe, just maybe, that was finally enough. It didn't end with whispers and emails. It never does with people who believe they are owed your silence. The next move came quietly, insidiously, wrapped in the familiar softness of my mother's voice at my door. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of winter day where the cold seems to press against the windows like a living thing. I was filing patient notes at my desk, a mug of lukewarm tea forgotten beside me, when I heard it, a soft, almost tentative knock. I didn't move at first. I just listened to the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and calm. Then I rose, walked slowly to the door, and peeked through the peephole. There they were, my mother, my father, and Ethan, standing awkwardly on the front step, bundled in coats and forced smiles. A family portrait painted in desperation. I didn't open the door right away. I didn't feel fear, only a detached sort of sadness, the kind you feel when you finally realize the rescue ship you've been waiting for is just another mirage. I opened the door a fraction, enough to let the cold seep in, but not enough to invite them inside. My mother spoke first, her voice carefully calibrated to sound gentle. "We just want to talk," she said, clutching her purse like a lifeline. I didn't move. I didn't nod. I didn't soften, because I finally understood they weren't here for me. They were here for the version of me who still thought love could be bartered, for the girl who used to fold herself smaller and smaller to fit into the narrow spaces they allowed. That girl didn't live here anymore. The silence stretched between us, thick and brittle. I saw the flicker of frustration in my father's eyes, the way Ethan shifted his weight from foot to foot, like he wanted to be anywhere else. They were uncomfortable. Good. After a long moment, I said the only word I needed to say. No. No explanations. No bargaining. No reopening wounds they had never tried to heal. My mother's face crumpled, part confusion, part offense, as if she couldn't quite believe that the reliable scaffolding she had leaned on for so long had simply stepped away. I closed the door, quietly, not slamming it, not making a scene, just closing it and locking it. On the other side, I heard their muffled voices rising, first pleading, then frustrated, but I didn't listen. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and wrapped my hands around my now cold tea, letting the silence settle over me like a bomb. Across the room, the framed letter from Celeste sat beside my computer, the ink still smudged slightly at the corners where she had pressed too hard while writing. I looked at it, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the weight of expectations pressing down on my chest. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to earn my place in a family that only ever measured me by the ways I failed to reflect the image they cherished of themselves. I thought about every time I had swallowed my own pain to make them comfortable, every time I had built a bridge out of my own brokenness, just so they wouldn't have to feel the cold water below. And I thought about the truth, the one I had finally stopped running from. I wasn't created to be convenient. I wasn't born to be a mirror for their pride or a sponge for their disappointments. I was something else entirely, and maybe, just maybe, that was finally enough. They didn't leave right away. I heard the soft scuff of shoes against the doormat, the low murmur of hurried conversation, the desperate edge creeping into their voices. My mother knocked again, lighter this time, almost apologetic. "Natalie, please, we just want to talk." But I stayed where I was, seated at my desk, the framed letter from Celeste a quiet anchor in the growing storm. I took a sip of my cold tea, savoring the bitter taste. I let the knocking continue until it faded into silence. For the first time, I understood that forgiveness didn't always mean reopening the door. Sometimes it meant choosing not to. Sometimes it meant standing still while the people who had hurt you wore themselves out against the wall you finally built. A wall not of anger, but of self-respect. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Eventually, I heard the shuffle of footsteps retreating, the soft thud of car doors closing, the low growl of the engine starting. They were gone. Not defeated, but denied. I rose slowly, walking to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see the back of their car disappearing down the snow-dusted street. No part of me longed to run after them. No part of me ached to call them back. Instead, I felt a deep, resonant peace settle into my bones, the kind of peace that only comes when you finally stop begging for a seat at a table that was never built for you. I turned from the window, moving through my small, quiet apartment with a steadiness I hadn't known I possessed. The Christmas tree still sat in the corner, unlit but no longer sad. The unopened gifts stacked neatly, not as symbols of rejection, but as evidence that I had tried, that I had loved in the best ways I knew how, that I had not failed, they simply hadn't recognized what they had been given. I made myself another cup of tea, stronger this time, the steam rising in lazy spirals. I wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders and sat back down at my desk. The letter from Celeste caught the edge of the light, the handwriting steady and sure. You made a difference, she had written. You didn't give up. You made her feel like she mattered. I ran my fingers lightly over the frame, feeling the slight ridges of the wood, the coolness of the glass, tangible reminders that even when the people closest to you refuse to see your worth, someone else will. Someone honest. Someone paying attention. I thought about all the years I had spent bending myself into smaller and smaller shapes, trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. I thought about the exhaustion, the endless hustle for affection, the way I had mistaken tolerance for love. And I thought about the moment I had closed that door, not with rage, not with bitterness, but with finality. It wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. They hadn't come because they loved me. They had come because they needed me, needed the quiet, compliant version of me to patch over the cracks they refused to acknowledge. But that girl was gone. In her place was a woman who understood that no matter how much you love someone, it's not your job to make them whole. It's not your duty to sacrifice yourself on the altar of their comfort. It's not your destiny to stay broken so they can feel complete. I sat there as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in clean, unbroken white, and I realized, maybe for the first time, I was free. Days passed, slow and strangely soft, like the first deep breaths after a long-held tension finally breaks. I went back to work. I made rounds at the hospital. I sat with patients whose families still came, and with those whose families had long stopped visiting. I listened. I stayed. I did the work that mattered, the work no one ever threw a party for. One afternoon, a small package arrived at my door, no return address, just my name written in careful, slanted handwriting. I opened it cautiously, peeling back the brown paper to reveal a letter tucked inside thick, ivory-colored stationery. The ink was smudged slightly at the corners, a human touch in a world that often felt too polished. It was from Celeste. She wrote about her grandmother, about how she still practiced yoga twice a week, still walked to the farmer's market every Saturday morning. She wrote about how years ago, when the world had quietly started giving up on an old woman with failing kidneys and a fading spirit, there had been one doctor who didn't, who sat by her bedside long after visiting hours ended, who treated her not as a burden, but as a person still capable of joy, still deserving of dignity. You didn't just save her life, Celeste wrote. You reminded her that she was still living. I read the letter twice, then a third time, tracing the words with my fingertips as if trying to etch them into my skin. I framed it that night, hanging it above my desk where the morning light would catch it, a small, quiet testament to the truth I had almost forgotten. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't heavy. I wasn't too much. I was exactly who I was supposed to be, and the people who couldn't see that were never the measure of my worth. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the itch to explain myself, to justify my boundaries, to apologize for the shape of my existence. I didn't owe anyone an entry ticket into my life, not even those who had once been given the first and best seats. Weeks later, another email arrived, this one less polished, more desperate, more telling. It was a final attempt, one last reach from the family that had spent years asking me to shrink, to smooth, to silence myself for their comfort. It began with the usual phrases, "We miss you. We never meant to hurt you. Can we start over?" And buried near the end, like a splinter they couldn't hide, was the real plea. Please ask Celeste to take down her post. Ethan's struggling to find work now. It's affecting his future. Not an apology, not a reckoning, just another transaction, another debt they believed I should pay. I didn't respond. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. Some doors, once closed, are better left that way, not out of anger, but out of respect for the person you fought so hard to become. As I sat at my desk that evening, filing patient notes, the sun dipped low outside my window, casting long golden streaks across the letter from Celeste. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and for the first time in years felt whole. Not because someone else finally told me I mattered, but because I had stopped asking for permission to believe it myself. So to anyone out there who's ever been made to feel invisible by the people who are supposed to see you first, to anyone who's been called too much, too serious, too inconvenient, let me tell you something they will never say. You're not too much. You are not a burden. And you never needed to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's broken story. Write your own. And if this story touched something inside you, if you've ever sat in the quiet after being left out and realized you were freer than you had ever been, then know this. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not show up at all.